August 1944. The fields of Normandy were still scarred from the D-Day landings, but inside the Allied command tents, a different kind of battle was about to explode. At the center of it all stood Bernard Montgomery, the legendary British general whose name was already etched into the history books. He was the mastermind behind some of the Allies' most daring victories, a man known for his iron will and his absolute intolerance for anything less than total obedience. If you crossed Montgomery, you didn't just risk your job, you risked your entire career, your reputation, and maybe even your country's standing in the war. And on this humid August morning, Montgomery was ready to do what he did best: eliminate a problem. The target, General Harry Crerar, commander of the 1st Canadian Army. To most of the American officers in Normandy, Crerar was barely a name. He wasn't flashy. He didn't make headlines. He didn't have the swagger of Patton or the charisma of Eisenhower. But in this moment, he was about to become the most important man in the Allied chain of command. Because Montgomery wasn't just thinking about removing a subordinate. He was about to challenge the entire idea of national pride, military autonomy, and the fragile unity that held the Allies together. The orders were practically written. All Montgomery had to do was sign his name, and Crerar would be finished, stripped of command, sent home in disgrace, and replaced by someone more willing to follow orders without question. For Montgomery, it would have been as easy as pouring his morning tea. He'd done it before, and he'd never lost a minute of sleep over it. But this time, something was different. This time, the consequences would reach far beyond the muddy fields of France. This wasn't just about military discipline. This was about the power struggle at the heart of the Allied war effort, a struggle that could shake the entire coalition to its core. Imagine the tension in that tent, the air thick with the smell of mud, sweat, and distant gunfire. Maps covered every surface, marked with the shifting front lines of a war that was supposed to be turning in the Allies' favor. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The Americans, the British, the Canadians, all fighting the same enemy, but each with their own ambitions, their own scars, and their own sense of what victory should look like. And now, with one signature, Montgomery could set off a chain reaction that would force every nation to pick a side. But what happened next was something no one expected. Instead of quietly accepting his fate, Crerar looked Montgomery in the eye and delivered a message that would echo through history. He didn't threaten with weapons or raise his voice. He simply told Montgomery that firing him wouldn't just mean dealing with the Canadian Army, it would mean dealing with Canada itself. The government, the people, and every political consequence that came with them. In that instant, the balance of power shifted. The man who had stared down Rommel in the desert found himself facing a new kind of resistance, one built not on force, but on the unbreakable will of a nation. To understand why this moment mattered, and why it still sends shockwaves through military history, you have to look beyond the headlines and the victory parades. You have to see the hidden battles, the personal rivalries, and the national pride that shaped every decision on the road to victory. Because sometimes, the most important fights aren't the ones fought with guns and tanks. They're the ones fought with words, with courage, and with the quiet determination to stand your ground, no matter who's giving the orders. And what happened in that tent in Normandy would change the course of the war in ways no one could have predicted. On the surface, the summer of 1944 looked like the Allies' unstoppable moment. American newspapers were filled with bold headlines: Allies break through, Nazis in retreat, and families across the United States dared to hope that their sons might be home by Christmas. The D-Day landings had shattered Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and the breakout from Normandy seemed to promise a swift end to the bloodiest conflict in human history. But behind those headlines, inside the canvas walls of Allied headquarters, the reality was far more complicated and far more dangerous. The truth is, coalition warfare is never as simple as the history books make it sound. The American, British, and Canadian armies were fighting side by side, but unity was more of an illusion than a fact. Every day, generals and staff officers navigated a maze of egos, national interests, and old grudges. The Americans brought overwhelming firepower and resources, but they were still the newcomers in the eyes of their British allies, who had been fighting since the very first days of the war. The Canadians, meanwhile, had paid a heavy price in battles that most Americans had never even heard of, places like Deep, where thousands of young men had been lost in a single day. Inside those headquarters, the air was thick with tension. Maps covered every table, phones rang with urgent messages, and the distant thunder of artillery was a constant reminder that the enemy was never far away. But the real battle wasn't always against the Germans. It was often a battle of wills between the Allied commanders themselves. Every decision, every attack, every pause, every shift in the front lines was the result of negotiation, compromise, and sometimes outright confrontation. For American officers, this was a crash course in the brutal realities of coalition command. The U.S. Army was used to clear lines of authority, to orders that were followed without question. But in Normandy, nothing was ever that simple. Every move had to be weighed against the political consequences, the risk of offending an ally, or the fear of undermining the fragile trust that held the coalition together. One wrong step, and the entire Allied effort could unravel. And at the center of this storm stood Bernard Montgomery, a man whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by his reputation for being impossible to work with. Montgomery demanded absolute loyalty. He expected his orders to be followed to the letter, no matter what. Generals who challenged him didn't just risk their jobs, they risked being erased from the war entirely. For American commanders who valued initiative and boldness, this was a constant source of frustration. But for the Canadians, it was something even more personal. The Canadians had been fighting since the very beginning, often overlooked and underestimated by their larger allies. They had their own heroes, their own tragedies, and their own sense of what it meant to fight for freedom. And now, with the fate of the entire campaign hanging in the balance, they were determined not to be pushed aside or treated as expendable. The tension between national pride and coalition unity was a powder keg, and everyone in Normandy knew it. This was the hidden war behind the war, a struggle for respect, recognition, and the right to make decisions that would shape the future of nations. For American viewers, it's a reminder that victory in World War II wasn't just about tanks and planes. It was about people, real people, fighting for their place in history, sometimes against their own allies as much as against the enemy. And as the summer wore on, the cracks in the Allied command grew wider. Every meeting, every order, every whispered conversation in the shadows of those headquarters tents was another move in a high-stakes game that could decide the fate of millions. The world saw headlines of triumph, but inside the Allied camp, the tension was building toward a confrontation that would change everything. But the real story of Normandy wasn't just about generals and strategies. It was about the men who stood their ground, the nations that demanded respect, and the moments when the future of the war hung by a thread. And as the pressure mounted, one quiet Canadian general was about to step into the spotlight, and nothing would ever be the same. If you asked most Americans in 1944 to name the Allied generals leading the charge across Europe, you'd hear names like Eisenhower, Patton, or maybe even Bradley. But Harry Crerar, for many, he was a mystery, a name buried in the fine print, a face rarely seen in the headlines. Yet in the high-stakes chess game of World War II, Crerar was about to make a move that would shake the entire Allied command structure. So who was this quiet Canadian general who dared to stand up to Montgomery, the most feared British commander of the war? Harry Crerar was, in many ways, the opposite of what Americans expected from a wartime leader. He wasn't a battlefield showman. He didn't deliver fiery speeches or charge into the fray with a pearl-handled revolver. Instead, Crerar was a man of precision, a thinker, a planner. A strategist who believed that wars were won not just by bold attacks, but by careful preparation and relentless attention to detail. Born in Hamilton, Ontario, Crerar grew up in a Canada that was still finding its place on the world stage. He joined the army before World War I, serving with distinction but never seeking the spotlight. Between the wars, while American generals like MacArthur and Marshall were making names for themselves, Crerar was stuck in Ottawa, wrestling with budgets and bureaucracy. He spent years fighting for resources in a country that, frankly, didn't want to spend money on its military. To many, he seemed more like a desk officer than a battlefield commander. But that's exactly what made Crerar so dangerous to underestimate. While others chased glory, he learned how to navigate the political minefields of military command. He understood that in a coalition war, power didn't just come from rank or reputation. It came from representing something bigger than yourself. Crerar was more than just a general. He was the voice of Canada's national pride, the guardian of its sacrifices, and the living memory of every Canadian family who had lost a son in battles like Deep. The British High Command, Crerar looked like a bureaucrat promoted beyond his abilities, a man who belonged in an office, not on the front lines. Montgomery, in particular, saw him as a weak link, someone who would follow orders without question. But Crerar's calm exterior hid a spine of steel. He had watched Canadian soldiers be treated as expendable in World War I, thrown into battles planned by others, their bravery overlooked and their losses ignored. He swore it would never happen again. For American viewers, Crerar's story is a reminder that not all heroes wear the same uniform or fit the same mold. In a war dominated by larger-than-life personalities, he was the quiet force who refused to let his nation be pushed aside. He didn't need to shout to be heard. His authority came from the weight of a country that had been fighting since the first day of the war, a country that demanded respect on the world stage. Crerar's leadership style was methodical, almost surgical. He believed in process, in discipline, in making sure every piece of the puzzle fit before moving forward. Some saw this as weakness. But in the chaos of Normandy, where every mistake could cost thousands of lives, it was exactly what the 1st Canadian Army needed. He wasn't there to win medals for himself. He was there to bring his men home. And as the pressure mounted in the summer of 1944, Crerar's true strength began to show. He wasn't just fighting for his own career. He was fighting for the dignity of every Canadian soldier, for the right of his country to be treated as an equal partner in the greatest military alliance the world had ever seen. In a war where so much depended on the egos and ambitions of a few powerful men, Crerar's quiet determination would soon become the deciding factor in a confrontation that would echo far beyond the battlefields of France. But before that moment arrived, the weight of Canadian sacrifice and the memory of a single, devastating day would set the stage for a showdown that no one in Allied headquarters could ignore. To truly understand why Harry Crerar stood his ground in Normandy, you have to look back at a moment that still haunts Canadian memory, a moment that most Americans have never heard about, but one that shaped the entire Allied campaign. That moment was the Deep Raid of 1942, a single day of bloodshed that left scars across a nation and changed the way Canada saw itself in the war. Imagine this. It's August 19, 1942. Nearly 5,000 Canadian troops stormed the beaches of Deep, France, in what was supposed to be a bold strike against Nazi defenses. The plan was ambitious, maybe even reckless. The hope was to test German strength, gather intelligence, and prove that the Allies could hit back hard. But from the first moments, everything went wrong. The beaches were a death trap. Machine guns raked the sand, artillery pounded the landing craft, and barbed wire turned every step into a nightmare. By nightfall, fewer than 1,400 Canadians made it back to England without wounds. Over 3,300 were killed, wounded, or captured in just a few hours. For Canada, Deep wasn't just a military disaster, it was a national trauma. Families across the country opened telegrams with shaking hands, learning that sons, brothers, and fathers would never come home. The headlines in Canadian newspapers were filled with grief and anger. Why had so many been lost? Who was responsible? The answers were complicated, but one thing was clear. Canada had paid a price in blood, and that sacrifice demanded respect. This memory was never far from Harry Crerar's mind. He knew what it meant to send men into battle, and he carried the weight of every Canadian casualty on his shoulders. For him, command wasn't just about tactics or strategy. It was about honoring the lives that had already been lost and making sure that Canadian soldiers were never again treated as expendable. He remembered the First World War, when Canadian troops were often used as shock troops by British generals, thrown into the fiercest fighting with little regard for their survival. Crerar was determined that this time, things would be different. For American viewers, it's easy to see World War II as a story of unity and shared sacrifice. But beneath the surface, every nation brought its own wounds, its own history, and its own demands for recognition. The Canadians had been in the fight since the very beginning, long before the United States entered the war. They had fought and died in places that rarely made the front page in New York or Chicago, but those battles mattered deeply to every Canadian family. Crerar's sense of duty was shaped by this legacy. He wasn't just a general, he was the guardian of a nation's honor. He understood that every decision he made would be judged not just by military success, but by the families waiting back home. He knew that the eyes of Canada were on him, and that any sign of weakness or submission to British command would be seen as a betrayal of those who had already given everything. This is what made the tension with Montgomery so explosive. For Montgomery, command was about authority and obedience. For Crerar, it was about respect and remembrance. He wasn't willing to let Canadian soldiers be used as pawns in someone else's game. He demanded a seat at the table, a voice in every decision, and the right to say no when the cost was too high. The Deep Raid was more than just a failed operation. It was a turning point in the way Canada saw itself and its role in the war. It was a reminder that sacrifice comes with a price, and that price must be honored by those in command. For Crerar, every order carried the weight of deep, and every confrontation with Montgomery was about more than just military protocol. It was about making sure that Canada's sacrifice would never be forgotten, and that its soldiers would never again be asked to pay the ultimate price without a say in their own fate. And as the anniversary of Deep approached in August 1944, that memory would set the stage for a confrontation that would test the very limits of Allied unity. August 19, 1944. The date was heavy with meaning for every Canadian in Normandy. It marked exactly 2 years since the Deep Raid, a day of loss, courage, and heartbreak that still echoed through every Canadian unit. On this day, General Harry Crerar made a decision that would ignite one of the most dramatic confrontations of the entire Allied campaign. While the guns thundered in the distance and the fate of Europe hung in the balance, Crerar chose to attend a solemn memorial service for the men lost at Deep. He didn't just send a message or a wreath. He went in person, standing shoulder to shoulder with the survivors and the families who had come to remember. For Crerar, this wasn't just a ceremony. It was a promise that the sacrifices of Canadian soldiers would never be forgotten, not by their commander, not by their country, and not by history itself. But at the very same hour, Bernard Montgomery had called a high-level commanders' conference. In Montgomery's world, his meetings were sacred. Attendance wasn't optional. Orders from the top were to be followed without question, and any sign of defiance was met with swift, ruthless consequences. When Montgomery learned that Crerar had skipped his conference to honor the fallen at Deep, the temperature in Allied headquarters dropped to freezing. To Montgomery, this was more than a scheduling conflict. It was outright insubordination. Montgomery's reaction was immediate and cold. He began drafting the orders to remove Crerar from command. The message was clear. No one, not even the leader of the 1st Canadian Army, was above the rules. In the past, Montgomery had ended careers with a single signature, and he was fully prepared to do it again. The machinery of military discipline was already grinding into motion. Crerar's fate seemed sealed. But what happened next would stun everyone in the Allied chain of command. Instead of backing down, instead of apologizing or begging for forgiveness, Crerar responded with a calm, unwavering resolve. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply explained in measured words that his authority didn't come solely from the British command structure. He served under the Canadian government, and that government had the final say over its soldiers. Firing him wouldn't just be a matter of military discipline. It would trigger a political earthquake, one that would reach all the way to Ottawa, Washington, and London. Crerar's message was simple but powerful. If you want to remove me, you'll have to deal with Canada, the government, the people, and every consequence that comes with it. In that moment, the confrontation shifted from a personal dispute to a test of national sovereignty. For the first time, Montgomery realized that this wasn't just about one general's career. It was about the rights of an entire nation to control its own destiny, even in the middle of the world's greatest war. For American viewers, this was a turning point that revealed the hidden fault lines within the Allied coalition. The United States had always valued independence and the right to self-determination. Now, watching the Canadians stand up for their own authority, American officers saw a reflection of their own values. It was a reminder that the fight against tyranny wasn't just happening on the front lines. It was happening in every decision, every negotiation, and every act of courage behind the scenes. Montgomery, the man who had stared down Rommel and outmaneuvered some of the most dangerous generals in history, suddenly found himself facing a new kind of resistance. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was unbreakable. Crerar's quiet defiance forced Montgomery to reconsider. The risk of a political crisis, the threat to Allied unity, and the possibility of public outrage in Canada and beyond, all of it was too much to ignore. In the end, Montgomery blinked first. The orders to remove Crerar were never signed. The 1st Canadian Army kept its commander, and the fragile balance of the Allied coalition held, at least for now. But the message was clear. In this war, respect had to be earned, and no nation, no matter how small, would be pushed aside without a fight. And as the campaign moved forward, the consequences of this confrontation would ripple through every battle, every decision, and every life on the front lines. The confrontation between Montgomery and Crerar wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a collision of nations, and the political stakes couldn't have been higher. For American viewers, this is where the story takes on a whole new dimension. In the United States, the idea of national sovereignty is sacred. The Founding Fathers built a country on the principle that no outside power could dictate its fate. Now, in the heart of World War II, that same principle was being tested on the battlefields of Europe, not just by the enemy, but within the Allied command itself. When Crerar stood his ground, he wasn't just defending his own position. He was defending the right of Canada to control its own destiny. The Canadian government had made it clear from the very beginning. Their soldiers would fight bravely, but they would not be treated as pawns in someone else's game. Every order, every deployment, every risk taken by Canadian troops had to be approved by Ottawa. This wasn't just a courtesy. It was a hard-won constitutional reality, forged through years of political struggle and national sacrifice. For Montgomery, used to absolute authority, this was a bitter pill to swallow. He had built his career on the idea that military efficiency required a single chain of command, free from political interference. But the world of coalition warfare was never that simple. Every nation brought its own priorities, its own history, and its own red lines. For the Americans, this was a familiar challenge. U.S. commanders had already faced their own battles over autonomy, pushing back against British attempts to dominate the Allied strategy. Now, watching the Canadians draw their own line in the sand, American officers recognized a kindred spirit, a nation determined to be heard, no matter the cost. The political reality was inescapable. Removing Crerar wouldn't just be a matter of military discipline, it would be a diplomatic disaster. The Canadian government would have no choice but to respond, and the fallout would reach all the way to Washington and London. Allied unity, already fragile, could shatter overnight. The headlines back home would be brutal. Canadian commander fired by British general. Ottawa demands answers. Allied rift threatens war effort. The risk wasn't just to morale, it was to the very foundation of the coalition. Behind the scenes, the highest levels of government were watching closely. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the importance of keeping every ally on board. Prime Minister Mackenzie King in Ottawa was under pressure from a public that demanded respect for Canadian sacrifices. Even Winston Churchill, never shy about asserting British interests, knew that a public feud could hand Hitler a propaganda victory and weaken the Allied cause at the worst possible moment. Crerar's stand was about more than just one man's career. It was about the principle that every nation, no matter its size, had a voice in the fight for freedom. For Americans, this was a powerful reminder of their own revolution, a time when standing up to a larger power changed the course of history. The lesson was clear. Unity didn't mean submission. It meant respect, negotiation, and the willingness to fight for your place at the table. Montgomery, for all his brilliance, was forced to recognize the new reality. The days of unquestioned British dominance were over. The war was being fought by a coalition, and every member mattered. The decision to back down wasn't just a personal defeat, it was a turning point in the way the Allies worked together. From that moment on, every major decision would be shaped by the need to balance military necessity with political reality. And as the campaign pressed forward, the consequences of this new understanding would be felt in every battle, every negotiation, and every hard-won victory on the road to Berlin. The dust from the confrontation between Montgomery and Crerar had barely settled when the 1st Canadian Army was thrust into one of the most grueling and overlooked campaigns of World War II, the Battle of the Scheldt. For American audiences, this is a chapter of the war that rarely makes the history books, but its impact was massive, shaping the fate of the entire Allied advance and testing the limits of leadership, endurance, and international cooperation. After the liberation of Antwerp in early September 1944, the Allies seemed poised for a breakthrough. The port of Antwerp was a glittering prize, one of the largest and most modern in Europe, capable of supplying the massive armies pushing toward Germany. But there was a catch. The port was useless as long as the Scheldt estuary, a long, winding waterway leading to the North Sea, remained under German control. The enemy held both banks, turning the estuary into a deadly bottleneck. No Allied ship could reach Antwerp's docks without running a gauntlet of artillery, mines, and machine gun nests. The responsibility for clearing the Scheldt fell squarely on the shoulders of the 1st Canadian Army. This was no ordinary assignment. The terrain was a nightmare, flat, flooded, and exposed. The Germans had opened the dikes, turning the Dutch and Belgian lowlands into a watery grave. Soldiers waded through icy water up to their chests, rifles held high, every step a gamble against hidden mines and sniper fire. The mud was so thick that tanks and trucks bogged down, and every advance was paid for in blood and exhaustion. For American viewers, the Battle of the Scheldt is a story of grit and sacrifice that echoes the toughest fights faced by U.S. troops in places like the Huichin Forest or the hedgerows of Normandy. The Canadians, along with British and Polish units under Crerar's command, faced relentless resistance. The weather was brutal, cold, wet, and unforgiving. Every mile gained was a victory against not just the enemy, but the elements themselves. But the real tragedy of the Scheldt was that it didn't have to be this way. Historians agree that the delay in launching the operation, caused in part by Montgomery's decision to prioritize Operation Market Garden, gave the Germans precious weeks to fortify their positions. By the time the assault began in earnest, the cost had skyrocketed. Over 13,000 casualties were suffered by the 1st Canadian Army alone, with thousands more among their British and Polish allies. The price of every inch of ground was measured in lives lost and futures changed forever. Yet in the face of these impossible odds, Crerar's leadership held the multinational force together. He managed a coalition of Canadians, Brits, Poles, Belgians, and Czechs, each with their own language, their own history, and their own reasons for fighting. It was a logistical and diplomatic nightmare, but Crerar's steady hand and respect for every nation's contribution kept the army moving forward. For Americans, this was a powerful example of what true coalition warfare looks like. Not just a united front on paper, but a daily struggle to balance egos, ambitions, and the harsh realities of war. When the first Allied convoy finally sailed into Antwerp on November 28, 1944, 85 days after the city's liberation, it marked a turning point in the war. The supply crisis that had threatened to stall the Allied advance was finally broken. But the victory came at a staggering cost, and the scars of the Scheldt would last long after the guns fell silent. For U.S. viewers, the story of the Scheldt is a reminder that victory in World War II was never guaranteed. It was earned, day by day, by men who fought through mud, water, and fire, often overlooked, but never forgotten. The lessons of the Scheldt and the leadership that made it possible would shape the final push into Germany and the ultimate defeat of the Nazi regime. And as the Allies pressed on toward Berlin, the quiet strength of leaders like Crerar and the sacrifices of those who followed him would prove that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones that history almost forgets. When the guns finally fell silent along the Scheldt, the world's attention quickly shifted to the next big headline: the race to Berlin, the collapse of Nazi Germany, and the celebrations of victory that swept across the United States. But beneath the surface, the legacy of what happened between Montgomery and Crerar and the brutal campaign that followed continued to shape the Allied story in ways that most Americans never saw. For U.S. viewers, the hidden legacy of this confrontation is a powerful reminder that the outcome of World War II wasn't just decided by famous generals or dramatic battles. It was shaped by the quiet, often invisible, struggles for respect, recognition, and national identity within the Allied coalition. The story of Harry Crerar and the 1st Canadian Army is a lesson in how the smallest decisions, made far from the front lines, can ripple outward, changing the fate of thousands and altering the course of history. After the Battle of the Scheldt, the 1st Canadian Army pressed on, fighting through the freezing winter, liberating towns, and pushing the enemy back mile by mile. But the real victory wasn't just on the battlefield. It was in the way Crerar's stand forced the Allies to confront the realities of coalition warfare. No longer could any one nation, not even the British or the Americans, dictate terms without considering the voices and sacrifices of their partners. The Canadians had proven that their contribution mattered, not just in numbers, but in principle. For Americans, this story echoes the very ideals that the United States was founded on: the right to self-determination, the value of every voice, and the belief that true strength comes from unity built on respect, not domination. The quiet confrontation in that Normandy tent set a precedent that would influence Allied operations for the rest of the war. Every major decision, every new offensive, had to be weighed not just for its military value, but for its impact on the fragile bonds holding the coalition together. The legacy of Crerar's defiance also reached beyond the war. In the years that followed, the lessons learned in Normandy and the Scheldt helped shape the way America approached its own alliances, from NATO to the United Nations. The idea that every nation, no matter how small, deserved a seat at the table became a cornerstone of post-war diplomacy. The United States, with its own history of fighting for independence, recognized the importance of listening to allies, building consensus, and respecting the sacrifices of others. But perhaps the most important legacy is the one that lives on in the stories of the men who fought and survived. For the soldiers of the 1st Canadian Army, the memory of standing their ground, of being led by a commander who refused to let them be treated as expendable, became a source of pride that lasted a lifetime. For American GIs who fought alongside them, It was a lesson in what real leadership looks like. Not just giving orders, but fighting for your men, your nation, and your principles, even when the world isn't watching. As the world celebrated victory in 1945, the quiet strength of leaders like Crerar and the sacrifices of their soldiers faded into the background. But their legacy endures in every alliance, every negotiation, and every moment when nations must choose between power and principle. For U.S. viewers, it's a reminder that history is shaped not just by the loudest voices, but by those who stand firm when it matters most. And as we look back on the greatest generation, it's worth remembering that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that happen far from the spotlight, won by those who refuse to be forgotten. Imagine for a moment if things had gone differently in that tense Normandy tent. What if Montgomery had signed those orders and Harry Crerar had been sent home in disgrace? The ripple effects would have reached far beyond the muddy fields of France. The 1st Canadian Army, a force that had become a symbol of national pride and international cooperation, would have been thrown into chaos at the very moment when clarity and unity were needed most. The delicate balance of the Allied coalition, already strained by egos, politics, and the sheer scale of the war, could have shattered, changing the course of history in ways we can only guess. For American viewers, this is more than just a story about foreign generals and distant battles. It's a lesson in the hidden power of leadership, the importance of standing your ground, and the value of every nation's voice in a global fight for freedom. The United States has always believed in the right to self-determination, in the idea that no one should be forced to follow orders blindly, especially when lives are on the line. The confrontation between Montgomery and Crerar is a reminder that these values aren't just American, they're universal, and they matter most when the stakes are highest. The quiet defiance of Harry Crerar didn't make headlines in New York or Washington. There were no ticker-tape parades, no front-page stories celebrating his stand. But his refusal to back down protected not just his own men, but the very principle that every ally deserves respect. In a war where so much depended on trust and cooperation, that principle was as vital as any weapon or strategy. Looking back, it's clear that the real victories of World War II weren't always won on the battlefield. Sometimes, they were won in moments of quiet courage, when someone chose to do the right thing, even when it meant risking everything. The story of Crerar and the 1st Canadian Army is a testament to the power of integrity, the strength of unity, and the idea that history is shaped as much by the decisions made in shadowy headquarters as by the thunder of guns on the front lines. For the United States, these lessons didn't end with the war. They became the foundation for how America would lead in the decades to come, building alliances, respecting partners, and understanding that true leadership means listening as much as commanding. The legacy of Normandy, the Scheldt, and the men who fought their lives on in every American soldier who stands shoulder to shoulder with allies around the world. So the next time you see a headline about international cooperation or hear a story about a quiet leader who refused to be pushed aside, remember the lesson of 1944. Sometimes, the most important battles are the ones fought with words, with principles, and with the unwavering belief that every voice matters. That's the kind of victory that endures long after the last shot is fired. And as we honor the greatest generation, let's not forget the quiet heroes, the ones who changed history not with a shout, but with a simple, unbreakable stand for what's right.